February 2018, Nairobi, Kenya. We're in a wealthy suburb called Karen. This is where the expats live and the Kenyans with money. The houses here are huge, on beautiful streets lined with trees. There's one house that's attracted a lot of local curiosity over the years. You can recognise it by the grand wrought iron gates at its entrance, topped with an ornate M. The sign of a local private security firm gleams bright red on the marble gateposts. If you peer through those gates, you won't be able to see much through the trees. But if the gates were to open and you walked up the drive, after some time, the home of the Martins would loom ahead of you. A grand property, surrounded by 20 acres of land, carefully tended to by their staff. This is where, on a Sunday evening in February 2018, Mrs. Martin returns home to find her 76-year-old husband sprawled on the bedroom floor, face down in a pool of his own blood. Esmond Bradley Martin was a prominent activist against the global illicit trade in elephant ivory and rhino horn. In his long career, he'd infiltrated criminal networks, exposed some very powerful people, and made a lot of enemies. Has it finally come back to bite him? To this day, the murder of Esmond Bradley Martin remains unsolved. At first, the media reported he was the victim of a burglary gone wrong. But in this episode, you'll hear from people who knew Esmond as a friend, and bit by bit, we'll piece together strange, inexplicable details that question that account and suggest a different story altogether. This is True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. Today's episode, Kenya's wildlife murder mystery. Esmond Bradley Martin stands out. Born in New York in 1941 to a very wealthy family, he's tall with a big shock of unruly white hair. He's a man of tradition and routine, and people who meet him call him eccentric.
He was a perfect gentleman. He dressed funny, he walked funny, but he was not somebody who ever said the slightest negative thing about anybody.
This is world-leading conservationist and wildlife campaigner Paula Kahumbu. She got to know Esmond and his wife very well over the years.
He wouldn't say what his values were. He wouldn't say what his opinion was. He would only tell you what his facts were. He was that kind of a person.
Before I knew him, I just thought he was a very strange person because he always wore a very fancy suit, usually three-piece, silk tie, silk handkerchief, out of the top pocket, and with this bright shock of white hair, writing with a fountain pen in A4 notebooks. I thought, who is this guy?
And this is Dan Stiles. Like Esmond, he investigates the illegal wildlife trade, and the two work together very closely over the years.
He was intensely curious about things. The first time seeing him after I hadn't seen him for a while would be an interrogation. And he did that with everybody. He just wanted information. What have you been doing? What did you find?
By the 1970s, Esmond and his wife had settled in Nairobi when they were both in their mid-30s. At this time, Paula lived here too.
In the 1970s, Nairobi was a city that was really on the move. It was a booming city, really. And a lot of people came to live in Nairobi because it was also a place where many jobs were available. I live in an area just south of the city which had a lot of animals, monkeys, buffaloes. We had lions in the city, giraffes. It was an incredible, incredible place.
Esmond and Prissy purchase a vast 20-acre plot of land in the luxurious Nairobi suburb of Karen and get to work building their house. It's beautiful, a large Georgian-style property with big French doors and multiple verandas. The Martins employ at least 4 members of staff, a cook, a driver, and 2 gardeners. Dan says that each room was painted a different colour.
So the sitting room was blue, Chrissy's study was bright red, the dining room was green. Upstairs, there was a spare bedroom that was yellow. The master bedroom was blue again, and so on. The house was full of knickknacks and mementos that they'd picked up in their travels, usually of animals.
Here's Paula.
If he ever invited you to his house, it was always an amazing experience. He would invite you in. He had a very beautiful house, very, very beautiful house. It was always soup for lunch. And you couldn't leave the house without signing his guest book.
Now, through the 70s, Esmond and Chrissy start to write books together on things like history and anthropology. It's said that they decide early on they don't want kids and instead pour themselves into their social life and work. Dan says the house was always full, and when they weren't entertaining guests with tables of food and extravagant entertainment, they worked.
They seemed to be always having a project, which was either planning or writing up one of their reports. And they were very meticulous about the work.
Now, by the late 1970s, there's a growing illegal trade in ivory, which comes from elephants, and rhino horn. Elephant tusks and rhino horns are worth a lot of money. There's a particularly big market for them in China, where they're used in traditional medicine and as a status symbol. Across Africa, in the east of the continent, but mainly South Africa, poaching is rife. Paula, the conservation expert, says that whilst the poaching industry began during colonisation, it ramped up in the latter half of the 20th century.
In the 1970s, East Africa really was a hotbed of trafficking for ivory, rhino horn, and other wildlife products. So in the 70s and even into the 80s, I remember elephants poaching was just the norm. It was something you saw in the headlines all the time. Elephants with their faces sawn off in the newspapers, in the magazines. The destruction of elephants and rhino was just something that was a fait accompli. These animals were going to disappear. That was just how it was. It seemed that there was nothing that could be done about it.
And this is where Esmond comes in. Esmond was originally a geographer, and over the years he'd become more and more interested in the wildlife trade. In the late 70s, Esmond received funding from 2 major conservation organisations to conduct his own research: the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. They want him to infiltrate the ivory and rhino trade. A lot of data they've gathered up to this point is purely anecdotal. Nobody's very sure about the actual details. Esmond agrees, and so begins what will be his major life's work. Over the next 3 decades, Esmond will travel all over the world, meticulously collecting data on the ivory and rhino horn trade. Amazingly, he's one of the first people to do so. Dan had met Esmond the previous year when Esmond turned up at one of his lectures at the University of Nairobi. They became friends and then colleagues.
I never dreamt I would ever work with Esmond on anything because I'd never done wildlife studies. But I was from the coast visiting in 1999. We were at dinner and Esmond just said, "You know, Dan, I'm about to start one of the biggest ivory surveys I've ever done. It's of Africa. And I need someone to do West and Central Africa because there's so many French-speaking countries and I don't speak French. Would you be willing to do it?" But that first survey in Africa almost killed me. It wasn't easy.
Through the 80s and 90s, Esmond is publishing a lot about ivory and rhino horn all around the world. He travels to and investigates the trade in places like Japan, Nepal, India, Malaysia, and South Korea. Paula says Esmond's main role was to enter ivory markets and ask a lot of questions.
He had an insane curiosity. He would look at every single item and photograph it. He would ask a lot of questions. He would claim to be a buyer, and people just would talk to him. He wasn't judgmental. He was just curious. And so he gathered a lot of information in markets. So his work allowed us to see the trends as they were changing. What kind of things were people making? What volume of these products were actually available for sale? And where were they, and who were the major buyers? What were the prices?
And he's getting a reputation. In the 1990s, he becomes the UN's Special Envoy for Rhino Conservation. Remarkably, he spends a year undercover and exposes some big names. He goes to Dar es Salaam, a financial hub on the Tanzanian coast and one of the key ivory smuggling ports, where he reportedly exposes an ambassador who transformed his embassy compound into an ivory factory. He travels to Zambia, where he apparently discovers a diplomat trying to smuggle large amounts of ivory into the country. He tracks the route from Africa to its biggest markets in China. He discovers that the price of ivory skyrockets as it gets further away from its source. Where African poachers are paid $20 per kilo of ivory they hand over, Chinese customers are paying 30 times more, upwards of $600 per kilo. By the 1990s, Kenya's rhino population has almost been completely wiped out. But in 1993, China bans the trade in rhino horn. It's a momentous achievement, partly thanks to Esmond's work. But as we reach the new millennium, the problem is far from over. Between 2007 and 2014, poaching in South Africa increased by 9,000%. And by 2017, the UN estimates the illegal wildlife trade could be worth up to $23 billion a year. So Esmond, Dan, and their other colleague, Lucy Vine, continue tirelessly in their efforts. 2 weeks after Esmond and Lucy have returned from yet another fact-finding mission, this time to Myanmar, they're greeted with some good news. On New Year's Eve 2017, China's new ban on the trade of elephant ivory, 25 years since they banned rhino horn, comes into effect. And so we come to the 4th of February 2018. We're at the Martin mansion in Karen, that wealthy suburb on the outskirts of Nairobi. Esmond has spent the last few weeks writing up the data from his trip to Myanmar. But today's a Sunday and he's not working. He's been invited to a barbecue. At around 11 in the morning, he packs his things and leaves the house. His driver takes him to Nairobi's National Park, which is about 40 minutes away. Paula says the barbecue was organised by a group of young members of the Friends of Nairobi National Park, and it was just like Esmond to feel he ought to go.
He was somebody who was obviously very high standing in society, but he was, and very elite in that sense, but he was also so down to earth, and he would go and sit on a picnic blanket and chat to ordinary day-to-day people who love going to the national parks.
Esmond and Dan's colleague Lucy is there. She leaves after lunch to go on a game drive. Esmond leaves not long after and gets back home mid-afternoon. Here's Dan.
And as far as I know, he just went home with the driver afterwards, probably got home, around 3 o'clock.
The house is empty. Chrissy had left half an hour earlier. Dan says she was a volunteer at the local animal orphanage and was spending the afternoon there. The cook isn't there either. After Chrissy drove off, The cook turned on the electric fence, locked the back door, and left as well to the servants' quarters for an afternoon rest. So Esmond, arriving home around 3 p.m, has just missed everyone.
And then the event, the tragic incident took place after that. And that's about all I know.
Nobody knows exactly what happens next. This is what we do know. At around 6 o'clock, as it's getting dark, Chrissy, Esmond's wife, returns home. She notices her husband's car parked on the drive. She unlocks the door and shouts, "I'm back." There's no reply. She goes to the library on the ground floor to see if Esmond's home yet. He's not there. She goes upstairs to his study. No sign of him there either. Chrissy decides to have a nap before dinner, so she goes to her bedroom. She and Esmond don't share a room. She's not been asleep long when she's woken by the sound of the back door opening. It's the cook who's returned to make dinner. Chrissy goes downstairs and asks the cook if he's seen her husband. He replies that he hasn't. By now, Chrissy's worried. She's been home for nearly an hour and still no sign of him. She walks back upstairs and this time goes to Esmond's bedroom. Esmond is lying face down on the carpet. He's been stabbed multiple times in his neck and there's a tie gagging his mouth. By the next morning, the news has spread around the globe.
Well, I was at my home in Diani Beach, and it was the morning of the 5th of February. I woke up and my email inbox was absolutely inundated with emails from various people commenting in one way or another about, Esmond's death and what had happened. And I started getting contacted by all kinds of journalists.
The police's first theory is that it's just a burglary that's gone wrong. Botched burglaries happen all the time in Nairobi. However, as police cars arrive at the Martin mansion and the investigation gets underway, that explanation begins to fracture. For starters, nothing obvious had been stolen. Esmond's wallet was still in his pocket, with the equivalent of about $100 in cash. His mobile phone was in another pocket, and his watch was left on the table. Just outside the entrance to his bedroom, Esmond had left more cash and his debit card. Both were untouched. Then there were no signs of forced entry. In fact, the back gate was unlocked. It was normally locked with a padlock, but that was missing. So, if not a burglary gone wrong, then what? Here's theory number 2. Police turn their attention to the household staff. There are a number of details that suggest this may have been an inside job. So police immediately arrest some of the house staff and bring them in for questioning. Firstly, there's the unlocked back gate. Then there's the panic alarm. Compared to some other parts of Nairobi, Karen's known for being a safe neighbourhood, but still, its wealthy residents take precautions. Like most houses in Karen, the Martin mansion was equipped with panic alarms. Esmond normally had one by his bedside, but the police, searching his room, found it under his bed. They made a note of this, but crucially, they couldn't follow up. That panic alarm mysteriously disappeared after that day and has never been seen since. Then there's the electric fence. Remember, the cook had turned it on when he left the main house to go back home for a nap. But he tells police that when he returned to work a few hours later to cook dinner, he noticed that the fence had been turned off. He thought that was weird. It's not clear how long the household staff are held for, but there's no evidence they had anything to do with it, and they're later released. So, to the third theory. Attention next turns to Esmond's work. Global news organisations particularly focus on this. Conservation is dangerous work. In 2017, 197 wildlife activists were killed globally. That's almost 4 a week, and twice as many as 5 years previously. Just a few months after Esmond died, another high-profile conservationist was murdered in Nairobi, a woman called Joanna Stutchbury. She'd received multiple death threats because of her environmental activism. It's undoubtedly a dangerous job. However, interestingly, Esmond's friends don't buy this theory.
Esmond didn't have any enemies, and he didn't threaten anybody. He didn't name names in any of the reports. He never worked with law enforcement like some of the NGOs today do. They work very closely with police and other law enforcement agencies to pull off stings. Esmond never did anything like that. So I don't think he was seen as a threat by any of these guys.
Paula was in touch with Esmond the week running up to his death, and she says he never said anything about feeling in danger.
I wouldn't say that it was just an ordinary crime or a robbery. It feels like there was something else going on.
So, to theory 4. Some reports suggest the person who killed Esmond did it because they wanted to steal his property. Territorial disputes and violent land grabs are becoming more common in Nairobi. And apparently there's a problem with unsolved murders in Karen of rich expats with lots of land. The only thing that police noticed was disturbed in Esmond's room was a green filing cabinet. The key had been left in the lock. It's not clear what had been inside, but it's believed that cash and documents relating to the estate were stolen. Dan also questions this.
The fact that Chrissy is still in the house sort of seems to negate that theory. If it had been a land grab, the land would be grabbed, and it hasn't been.
So that leaves us with theory number 5, that Esmond had put a target on his back when he got involved in a local dispute against a prominent church. In the months before Esmond's death, the residents of Karen had been entangled in a very heated dispute. The Seventh-day Adventist Church had been building a new development on a plot of land in the area, backed by very powerful local figures. But it had caused uproar. Residents rallied together as part of the Karen Langata District Association, the KLDA, to campaign against it. Esmond had not only been part of the KLDA, but one of its most outspoken and prominent members. The plot of land that the church wanted to build on was right next to his house, and he wasn't happy about it. In the weeks before someone entered his house and killed him, he'd been raising funds to stop it. Now, this has been suggested by some media outlets as a possible theory, though Duncan Munua, a KLDA official, has told local media he doesn't believe it's connected. Both Dan and Paula warn there's no evidence.
It's a church, and I think it very unlikely they would murder. They have some powerful politicians in their congregation, and I don't think it mattered what Esmond said.
We reached out to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, both the Karen branch and their headquarters, for comment. They didn't reply. We tried to reach Chrissy during the making of this episode to see if she wanted to speak to us, but were unable to reach her. We've been told that she, understandably, avoids the media when it comes to questions about who killed her husband. So, who killed Esmond Bradley Martin? Well, nobody knows. It's unclear if the investigation is still ongoing. And since those initial arrests of the house staff, it doesn't look like there have been any other suspects. The night her husband died, Chrissy hired a private investigator. But again, that doesn't seem to have produced any answers. Towards the end of 2020, 2.5 years later, a lawyer for the family wrote to the US Embassy in Nairobi and the FBI legal team in Kenya asking for help. They say this is just one more in a pattern of violent murders that have gone unsolved, and it's making the Kenyan police and judiciary look bad. We reached out to the US Embassy and the FBI's legal team for comment to ask if anything's been done in response to the family's request. They didn't reply. We also approached the Kenyan police and judiciary to ask why Esmond's murder is still unsolved, if any more arrests have been made, and what state the case is in. They too didn't reply. Dan says there could be a different reason altogether for what happened to Esmond.
It looks to me like it was someone with a personal grudge, a personal problem with Esmond. And, you'd have to find out who that person might be and the motivation. Because all the other theories don't fit. Botched robbery doesn't fit, land grab doesn't fit, church doesn't fit, work doesn't fit. So, what's left? Sort of a process of elimination,
At one point, Esmond's murder and the mystery surrounding it was headline news. In 2018, even the UK's royal family waded into the subject when Prince William called him one of the conservation world's unsung heroes. For Paula, it's important not to forget Esmond's grieving wife Chrissy in all of this. Today, Esmond's name, his work, and what he did are largely forgotten by those outside the conservation bubble. And at the centre of it remains Chrissy, widowed and in the dark as to who killed her husband.
I think we should all be very generous in not saying anything that might be disrespectful towards her. I think it's a huge tragedy for Kenya that we've lost Esmond. He was such an important person in our conservation circles. It's really a pity when you lose somebody like that who plays such an important role both in society but also in the science of addressing this challenge of wildlife poaching in Africa.
This was True Crime Reports, a global crime series from Al Jazeera. In our next and final episode in this season, we're in South Korea, where in 2023, a young woman who was obsessed with true crime tried out a murder of her own. A horrific story that raises serious questions about the ethics of the genre and the impacts it can have. Thank you for joining. See you next week.